All right, so again, welcome everyone. My name is Jason. We are now recording this session. Today is February the 17th, and this is the ReOrienting, the study of religion conference series. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Armando Salvatore to introduce this lecture series and today's speaker. Professor Salvatore.
Thank you, Jason. We are hosting Benjamin Schewel tonight, and I'm particularly happy to have Benjamin with us now because this is a crucial juncture in our lecture series, and this is a topic that really shows the potential of this idea of reorienting religion. Um, I'm just saying a few words about Ben. Uh, Ben is a senior fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, but even more importantly, he is the director of a research center, of a brand new research center, which is called Center on Modernity in Transition. He has also other affiliations. He's also part of our team here at the School of Religious Studies at McGill. And he has authored a wonderful book um, titled 7 Ways of Looking at Religion, published by Yale University Press in 2017, and is currently finishing a second book, Encountering the Axial Age, also to be published by Yale University Press. Now, today's talk is related to this book on the Axial Age. It features Marshall Hodgson. Marshall Hodgson is probably the most important historian of Islam, but he was also the one who quite single-handedly initiated the sociology of Islam. And this is why he played a very important role also in those beginnings of reflections on religion and Islam that we are considering the kind of inspiring history or prehistory of our series here. So he was also a very close colleague and research and conversation partner of Wilfred Cantwell Smith. I particularly had the privilege to read some of their correspondence at the time when Smith was launching the institute here in the early 1950s, and Smith really tried to hire him here at McGill at the institute. But Hodgson never left the University of Chicago, where he was a quite prominent scholar and head of the Committee on Social Thought. So there were a lot of debates, I mean, between them and also with other leading personalities here, like also involving Fazlur Rahman, Ismail al-Faruqi. And in that same spirit, we are trying to reorganize ourselves, I mean, in the same cosmopolitan spirit of the time, and of course, updating their conversations in terms of the challenges of today. And, a lot of things have been written about the problem, of conceiving of Islam, of the Islamic age, and what is the role of religion in them. And the topic of today really strikes at the core of those questions. Ben is additionally also a key partner in the kind of whatever we are planning as the aftermath of this series. First of all, the Keenan Conference on World Religions and Globalization, to be held in hopefully in May 2022, and we will try also to not just to host it in person, but also to broadcast it, as we are doing now. And also probably a lecture series, also a second lecture series leading up to the conference next academic year, with the tentative title of Cosmopolitan Connections in a Global Age. Let me see if I can share with you something else, or a couple of things. After several decades, finally, an Arabic translation of The Venture of Islam by Hodgson was published just in November. under the title, as you can see, of مغامرة الإسلام الضمير والتاريخ في حضارة عالمية. It's a very nice edition. I mean, they supposedly sent it to me. This is الشبكة العربية للبحث والنشر. And I was happy that to have, in a way, provoked this translation, because this is the same publisher that translated in Arabic my book, The Sociology of Islam and the Willie Blackwell History of Islam. And they said, oh, we read about this guy, Hodgson, must be interesting. What did he write? And then they said, of course, I mean, this is the main author within this historical sociology of Islam. And they decided to translate it. It took 3 years. It's apparently a high quality translation. I could not yet see it. But for those of you who read Arabic, this is also an occasion to expand on this set of ideas initiated by Hodgson that we are contributing to reshape. One other thing which I would like to share with you, and then I will stop speaking and give the word to our guest. I mean, there are always people to admit here. Am I still in the screen? Yes, I have to stop share. And so I'm going back to the normal keyboard, and I would like to share with you the link to the speaker series of Ben, that Ben is organizing and conducting at his own center. Let me see if it works now. This is the share name. Okay, this is the Commit website, and this is the speaker series being put out. Okay, I'm covering just the link to the, yeah, Benjamin was faster than me. But this is, I mean, I really wanted you to see the Commit website. I mean, not the one of the Keenan Institute, because I think it's also extremely beautiful and elegant. I mean, you can see also the podcasts of the previous lectures and the links to the full videos. And the title of the series is The Liberal Imaginary and Beyond, with really top speakers like Akil Bilgrami, Saskia Sassen, Sheila Ben Habib, Prasenjit Dwara, and also McGill's own Charles Taylor. So I think that we would like to have a third series next year, a little bit at the convergence of his series at Comet and Duke, and this one here this year, and the title would be Cosmopolitan Connections in a Global Age. And now, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Armando. I'm very grateful to be here. And I think in the spirit of this cosmopolitanism that Armando mentions, I might forewarn the audience that I'm not, first and foremost, a scholar of Islam. I'm a philosopher and an intellectual historian. And I'm work in particular on post-war philosophy of history, post-war globalism, intellectual history, and I've become interested in Marshall Hodgson through this angle. So when we get to the Q&A section, the more specific you might want to go into the field of Islamic studies and Islamic intellectual history, very quickly you will encounter the limits of my own expertise. So I would also ask for some generosity there, but just also to mention that my main field is philosophy from a Western perspective mainly, but I do take a strong interest in a more global interactional approach as well. So the title of my talk, and I'll share a PowerPoint that we can just, I think that should show up well, is Imagining the Islamic Ecumene, Marshall Hodgson as Philosopher of History. So Marshall Hodgson, as many of you know, was a promising historian who died in 1968 at the age of 46. During his brief professional career, he chaired the Interdisciplinary Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. During his lifetime, he published little, but is now known primarily for the posthumous 3-volume work, The Venture of Islam, which was released in 1974. And the 3rd volume of The Venture of Islam, even though still brilliant in many ways, is unfinished. So many of you would be familiar with Hodgson's work and also his position, his prominent position in the field of Islamic studies and its genesis, particularly in the Western Academy. But I want to approach his work here through the lens of philosophy of history, and particularly post-war philosophy of history, which is to say the philosophical discussions about history that crystallized in the aftermath of the Second World War. So what I'll do is first I'll just define a little bit what I mean by philosophy of history. So there's no single discipline or field called philosophy of history. It is an inquiry pursued by philosophers, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and area researchers of various sorts. So based on this definition of philosophy of religion, one could see Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Marx, Hume, Weber, Durkheim, Heidegger, Foucault, William McNeill, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Edward Said, David Christian. You could approach them all as philosophers of history. Obviously, that's not all that they are, but they do think philosophically about history. So at a broad level, philosophers of history strive to articulate and evaluate the basic concepts and methods that orient thought about the broad sweep of human history. They are particularly interested in examining the nature and significance of the modern age. And generally, they are motivated by some aspiration to disclose new and essential civilizational or intellectual possibilities for the future of humankind. So post-war philosophy of history, philosophical historical debates that take shape in the aftermath of the Second World War, tend to be influenced by 3 overarching problematics or dilemma. So the first was the quite evident failure of modern Western civilization to generate an age of universal enlightenment. So there was this expectation of linear progress towards some kind of enlightened rational utopia, and that the philosophical, the historical narratives of many during the period of the Enlightenment reflected this assumption. But then when the sort of ostensible centers of enlightened civilization not only participate in, but also generate the most violent and barbarous war in human history, it becomes very difficult to maintain this naive faith in linear progress. So this triggers a collapse in that linear Enlightenment vision of civilizational progress. So the second problematic that emerges in the aftermath of the Second World War is the failure of methodological nationalism to explain not only the emerging global realities and forces of the day, but also to make sense of the legacy and also the past of humanity's transnational, imperious, and religious patterns of community organization, of thought, of practice, of belief. So the sort of emerging national imaginary doesn't really make sense of the past and present realities of human affairs. And the third is the increasingly evident failure of the new post-war, Cold War global ideologies of American liberalism and Soviet communism to adequately balance the ongoing trajectories of global integration, particularly as these trajectories are shaped by the fields of scientific technology. So for many of these post-war philosophers of history, it's the threat of nuclear self-annihilation that is particularly egregious in revealing the limits of both American liberal and Soviet communist thought. So the overarching dilemma that begins to take shape, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s is how do we reconceptualize world history from a non-Western centric and truly global vantage point, yet do so in a way that meaningfully clarifies the social, moral, intellectual resources upon which humanity might draw in order to establish a more just, peaceful, and prosperous global civilization. So it was in this context of post-war philosophy of history that the idea of the axial age first emerged. So this is a concept, the axial age, that Hodgson used to orient his study of Islamic age civilization. The term was first coined by Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher, in 1949. It was then influentially developed by a range of prominent thinkers, including Lewis Mumford, the famed cultural critic and architectural essayist, Arnold Toynbee, Eric Voegelin, Shmuel Eisenstadt, the novelist Gore Vidal, Samuel Huntington, Jürgen Habermas, the French political philosopher Marcel Gauchet, Charles Taylor, to name a few. And obviously there are many more, McGill's Armando Salvatore being included. So the idea of an axial age is meant to name this period during the middle centuries of the first millennium BCE, during which a series of novel and resonant religious metaphysical movements, which included Greek philosophy, Hebrew prophecy, classical Zoroastrianism, Upanishadic Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and the classical Chinese schools of thought, reoriented the major centers of civilization throughout Eurasia. So Jasper's aim, which was quite explicit in articulating the idea of an axial age, was to overcome what he saw as the Christo and Western-centric bases of modern historiography, but also without embracing the countervailing posture of nihilistic fragmentation and endless critique. And Jaspers was very aware of this drift in modern Western thought, particularly through his analyses of the work of Nietzsche. And I think in our own time, that drift has also become even more prominent. Jaspers additionally aspired to ground a new pattern of global consciousness that would help humanity to address the challenges of global integration that it faced in the aftermath of the Second World War. So in this context, he envisioned a future second axial age that would provide humanity in some way with the moral and spiritual energies it needed to overcome what he saw as the quite pernicious runaway influence of modern technology. So in this latter aspect of Jasper's thought, and he actually played an important part in the post-war discourse on modern technologism, which is different than the axial age discourse, but connected, and also involved the debates of people like Heidegger, Jacques Ellul, Marshall McLuhan, and Herbert Marcuse. So at a very schematic level, I just wanted to present Jasper's overall vision of world history. And there's a very helpful quote from The Origin and Goal of History where he articulates his basic convictions. The history of mankind visible to us took, so to speak, two breaths. The first led from the Promethean age, i.e. prehistory, via the ancient civilizations to the axial period and its consequences. The second breath of history started with the scientific technological, the new Promethean age, and may lead through constructions that will be analogous to the organization and planning of the ancient civilizations into a new second axial period, to the final process of becoming human, which is still remote and invisible to us. So if you look here on the right of my screen, there's this graph, fairly schematic, that he includes in The Origin and Goal of History. And so he has these stages of civilization that he charts out of prehistory, then there's ancient civilizations, then there's the axial period, and then through these intermediate societies of the West, Byzantium, Islam, we're taken up into the age of modern science and technology, which begins this new trajectory of human history, which leads to the one world of mankind. And so at this very early post-war moment, Jaspers articulates these concepts with a degree of simplicity, which might not be well received today. But what's quite interesting to note is that Hodgson, when you look at his own arguments, he builds quite directly upon the sort of structural conceptual features of Jasper's vision of world history. So at that more, let's say, normative or philosophical, sort of practical philosophical level, Hodgson shared the desire of Jaspers and other axial age theorists to stimulate a more ideal form of global civilization by retelling the story of world history from a more culturally and spiritually expansive perspective. He felt that the global nature of the Second World War had demonstrated that, quote, mankind for the first time is ready for a global civilization and ready to appreciate effectively all past civilizations. So describing Hodgson's views and his motivations, Michael Geyer writes, worldwide material connections had created an infrastructure, but would and could not in and of themselves generate on a world scale what religions had achieved on a regional and trans-regional level over the past 2,000 years, to create an awareness, a consciousness of the unity of the world in all its diversity. So Hodgson aspired to see the emergence of this kind of a new paradigm of the unity of the world in all its diversity. And he explored it in terms of the potential reemergence of the moral and spiritual powers that humanity in the past had mobilized during and after the axial age, and that we would need again to mobilize in order to correct the trajectory of modern technologism and to establish a more balanced pattern of global civilization. So as an individual thinker, he sought to contribute to this, the emergence of this new paradigm by re-examining Islamic civilization from a global interactional perspective. So just to give a brief description of the place of Islam in the discourse on the axial age during and after the work of Paul Jaspers. Few axial age theorists have given Islamic civilization the seriousness it deserves. Again, I think Armando Salvatore here is one of those few, but beyond Hodgson and Armando, there are very few indeed. Most present it as a late-stage universalization of Hebrew monotheism, and one with far less modernizing potential than the incarnational framework of Christianity. Hodgson painted a very different picture, in fact. He described the Islamic Ecumene as the fullest expression of the civilizational possibilities of the axial age. In that regard, he argued that the venture of Islam brought humanity to the very threshold of the modern age. And also quite in a stimulating way, he claimed that studying the history of Islamic civilization would help to clarify certain enduring possibilities and meaningful civilizational change that still exist in the modern age. So I'll just provide two examples of how Hodgson's analyses of Islam would reorient certain prevalent assumptions in the axial age discourse. So the first is, appears in the book, The Transformations of Man, written by Lewis Mumford, just a few years after Jaspers' The Origin and Goal of History. And he writes, because of their original indifference to social institutions, the axial religions preaching brotherhood, love, and peace left untouched or almost untouched the practices of slavery, economic exploitation, and war. In short, the grossest evils of civilization. Now, Hodgson basically makes the complete opposite claim about the legacy of Islam, that it touched upon every aspect of social life. Islam tended to call forth a total social pattern in the name of religion itself. In many spheres, not only public worship, but such spheres as civil law, historical teaching, or social etiquette, Muslims succeeded quite early in establishing distinctive patterns identifiable with Islam as religion. So in a book, The Disenchantment of the World, written by Marcel Gauchet in the 80s, he makes a claim about the unique role that Christianity plays in generating the modern transformation. He writes, in order to understand the outbreak of modernity, we must, quote, highlight the distinctiveness of Western Christianity, the structural factors determining its originality and scope. I've said that the monotheistic idea alone could not do this. And so here he's identifying Islam with the monotheistic idea alone. The Christian philosophy of deliverance, therefore, presents a symmetrical counterpart to Islam, where submission through belief was the keynote. So Hodgson, again, proceeding in the complete opposite direction, though still situated within the same conceptual world of the discourse on the axial age, paints a completely different picture of the history and significance and legacy of Islam. He writes, thus Islamdom, being more cosmopolitan in the mid-Islamic periods than was the Occident, embodied more provisions for rational calculation and personal initiative in its institutions. Indeed, much of the shift from traditional to rational, which in Europe was part of modernization, has the air of bringing the Occident closer to what was already well established in the Islamic tradition. So, again, just having seen within the debate, the axial age discourse, how Hodgson begins to turn some of the mainstream assumptions on their heads by examining Islam, I want to now then just reiterate how firmly Hodgson's conceptual framework was rooted in that broad schema that we saw Jaspers articulate in The Origin and Goal of History. Obviously, he develops it with much greater sophistication and nuance and many qualifications, but still it's more of an internal modification to that scheme than it is a total reevaluation of it. So Hodgson begins by speaking of the agrarian age as an era of material civilization that stretches from roughly 3000 BCE to the 19th century. It generated a common form of agrarian age civilization, which in some ways is analogous to what Jaspers calls early civilization. So speaking of this form of civilization, Hodgson writes, productivity could be multiplied through the proliferation of specializations in crafts and crops made possible by the centering of surplus resources in cities, but not beyond the level at which the power of animals and of the natural elements could work. City life implied an accelerated pace of historical change. Yet basic change remained the exception, and innovation in principle an occasional matter. Historical and moral consciousness could envision a vast geographical scene of action, but could not achieve a transcultural worldwide perspective. So Hodgson then presents the axial age as a new stage or an emergent structure within the horizon of agrarianate civilization. So again, when Jasper speaks of this one breath of history in which there are these three unfolding stages, Hodgson is then presenting the axial age as an unfolding stage within the broad trajectory of agrarianate civilization. He writes, as is well known, toward the middle of the first millennium BC, in the same widely distant parts of the Ecumene appeared unexampled works of intellectual creativity that established new and comprehensive complexes of high cultural tradition. Afro-Eurasian history thenceforth can be presented as the interdependent and more or less parallel development of four major complexes of civilized traditions. The European complex with its core area from Anatolia to Italy along the north of the Mediterranean Sea, the complex in the region from Nile to Oxus centered in the Fertile Crescent and the Iranian highlands, the Indic in the Indian area and the lands to the southeast of it, and the Far Eastern in China and its neighboring lands. The culture of each of the regions was constantly expanding its sway beyond its original centers. Thus, jointly, they extend in all directions, millennium by millennium, the overall field of mercantile endeavor and of civilized history. So, where Hodgson's analyses become very distinctive within the broader trajectory of the axial age discourse is at this point when he's speaking of the unique trajectory of Middle Eurasia. He explains that the cultural region of Middle Eurasia, set at the center of the ecumenic cross-currents, was exceptional. Endowed with the oldest high cultural traditions and earliest to develop new ways, it did not at that time go on to fully develop its own identity in the new manner. Rather, it was subject to influences from all sides. So here we actually start to see an explanation for why potentially Islam has not been adequately understood within the axial age debate, is that the classic axial transformation that Hodgson describes of the emergence of a core civilizational complex with a unique literary and high cultural tradition didn't take shape immediately in the Middle Eurasian zone, and actually wouldn't be until the later emergence of Islam that this finally would crystallize. But there was nevertheless the latent beginnings of that. Yet here too, a core area and a core complex of traditions can be defined positively, namely that of the great prophets, notably Zarathustra in Iran and the biblical prophets among the Hebrews. These prophets founded strong literary traditions in Old Iranian and above all in Hebrew. Though at the time these traditions were politically submerged and none found general intellectual acceptance, they gradually became the most sacred heritages, developed in a greatly diverse ways of an increasingly large portion of the people of the Fertile Crescent and the Iranian highlands. So what Hodgson then goes on to say is that Islam, though much later than the classical axial revolutions, ultimately facilitated the completion of the axial transformation, the emergence of a united cultural zone with an integrated and integrating high cultural tradition in Middle Eurasia. The role of Islam in Afro-Eurasian history was to institutionalize the more egalitarian and cosmopolitan tendencies in Irano-Semitic culture. At last, the region from Nile to Oxus had its common literary language, like the other great regions. That language was built up precisely upon the prophetic heritage, and now its communalism, which before had fragmented the region, united it. The new Islamic tradition built not only on the several Irano-Semitic heritages themselves, including their originally Greek components, but on whatever seemed most readily exportable in the Indic and even the Chinese traditions. This made possible the spread of Irano-Semitic traditions across the hemisphere under the aegis of a single order bound together by common allegiance. This Islamicate social order finally formed the chief part of the wider world context impinging upon other societies of the hemisphere. So not only does Islam generate a form of Islamicate civilization that brings unity to the cultural zone of Middle Eurasia, which is broadly structured between the Nile and Oxus rivers, but it also brings a kind of ecumenic unity to Afro-Eurasia as a whole, interpenetrating and interconnecting these four major civilizational zones that emerged during the aftermath of the axial age. So what we've seen, Marshall Hodgson's analyses of Islam really add a great deal of nuance and complexity and scope and precision to the classical vision of the nature and consequences of the axial age. But also, they still emerge within that broad framework of these layers of civilization that Jaspers articulates. And this is also true of Hodgson's vision of modernity. So what Hodgson claims is that the modern transformation brought the agrarian age to an end. And therefore, it disrupted all the axial civilizational achievements that had blossomed atop these agrarianate foundations. So in this regard, he follows Jaspers fairly closely in presenting modernity as an age of science and technology. It's primarily the transformation of the material agrarianate civilizational order that is what emerges in modernity for Jaspers and also for Hodgson. Between about 1600 and 1800, there took place in Western Europe a general cultural transformation, at the core of which was a pattern of multiple technical specialization that left behind most of the basic presuppositions of all agrarianate society. Without the cumulative history of the whole Afro-Eurasian Ecumene, of which the Occident had been an integral part, the Western transmutation would be almost unthinkable. But it was part of the transmutational character of the new transformation that it broke down the very historical presuppositions which had maintained parity among Afro-Eurasian state societies. The old gradual diffusion and adjustment was no longer possible. All non-Western peoples were faced with the problem of coping as outsiders with the new order of civilized life as it was emerging in the Occident. So, as I was explaining, also Jaspers has this very specific vision of the future of humankind, in which he sees this age of science and technology as a necessary but highly limited cultural formation. He rejected the idea that the West, in whatever form, was the end of history. In many ways, rejected the ideas that scientific naturalism, that secularism, liberalism were in any ways the culminating forms of human civilization, but he also claimed to not know what would come next. He simply argued that if one observes the longue durée of human history, it's clear that the crises and turmoil of this new global era of human history that seemed to be emerging after the Second World War were necessitating some kind of deeper socio-spiritual transformation and some kind of transformation which could be likened to the first axial age. And what Jaspers claimed was what would have to emerge is some kind of new expression of the same spiritual and intellectual powers that generated the great religious and philosophical traditions of the past. But we would have to do so in such a way that would allow us to domesticate the runaway and quite pernicious influence of modern technology. And again, we find a very similar line of argumentation in the arguments and the writings of Hodgson. Modernity is neither the outcome of purely Occidental traits nor a stage through which each land can pass in its own way. It is an event in our common world history which we must face together. The real point in question is whether the high cultural tradition, that of fine arts, letters, religion, legal institutions, and the like can survive. Whether, for example, any form, however evolved, of the Islamic high culture as it was built up before 1800 can survive as a genuinely creative force alongside other comparable cultural heritages in the world. I think this is one of his most telling remarks. Obviously, Hodgson wrote primarily as a historian, and so didn't spend much time speculating on the future, but here some of his deepest intuitions and commitments seem to come out. If the great modern transformation was a massive event, a change of historical pace and of the historical presuppositions of 5,000 years, to which we are all still responding in our various ways, there is no reason to suppose that any pattern of response yet developed must be the final one. The future is still open, and crucial to any response must be its attitude to the pre-modern heritages which the transformation has put in question. So the main question that emerges at the outermost limits of Hodgson's reflections on the current period of history and its future possibilities, how might the same kind of socio-spiritual powers that arose during and after the axial age and that propelled the highest cultural achievements of pre-modern civilization be again deployed in order to remedy the grossest problems of the modern age, and particularly those surrounding the runaway influence of modern technologism? So this problematic resonates with Jaspers' discourse surrounding the idea of a second axial age, obviously without being so bald about his philosophical and normative commitments. But if you actually look into his manuscripts, there's these short essays called The Next Civilization. And so it's just very clear that Hodgson was taken to a certain extent by the same line of thought. So, I think there's a lot that can be drawn out from this aspect of Hodgson's intellectual trajectory and his legacy. I won't speak about the significance of this aspect of Hodgson's work to the field of Islamic studies, because this simply isn't a field that I know much about. As I mentioned more, my own field is that of philosophy of history, 20th century intellectual history, and so I can draw out a few interesting implications there. But I think when we get to the Q&A question, I really would like to hear others' reflections about, also the field of Islamic studies and how some of these arguments might be relevant or not. So the first point that I wanted to convey, hope that you draw away from this presentation. So clearly, Hodgson's arguments are deeply shaped by the philosophical vision of history that unfolds in the post-war period around the idea of an axial age. He shares the prominent axial age theorists, and particularly with Karl Jaspers, a desire to cultivate a framework that will enable humanity to mobilize the moral and spiritual resources it needs to domesticate the pernicious influence of modern technologism. He also employs very directly the broad schema of civilizational stages that emerges in Jaspers' thought, though obviously with greater sophistication, nuance, and scope. Hodgson's arguments must additionally be located within the broader post-war discourse on modern technologism, which additionally includes the likes of Heidegger, Jacques Ellul, Marshall McLuhan, Marcuse, Lewis Mumford, John Kenneth Galbraith, and more recently, Robert Bellah. So these two intellectual influences on Hodgson's work, though acknowledged, have not yet been explored with sufficient rigor and depth. And so I think in terms of the study of Marshall Hodgson, this is something that remains to be done. I have a certain amount of aspirations to do this in a future essay. We'll see whether or not that happens. So then the third point that I wanted to draw out is more about the relevance of Hodgson's work for these other more philosophical fields about philosophy of technology, philosophy of history, reflections on the axial age, and more broadly about the relevance of his careful ecumenic studies of Islamicate civilization to these debates. So Hodgson's research on Islamicate civilization allowed him to articulate not only an alternative genealogy for our global present, but also to plausibly and imaginatively explore new and essential possibilities for the future of humankind. If one reads his reflections on what the status of Islamicate civilization was in the late 18th century, how this kind of regional order of almost these kind of federated imperial systems was emerging, and how there's this threshold where perhaps this could have been what it would have looked like if a pattern of modernization technology had emerged out of this kind of order as opposed to the Western order. It's a very stimulating reflection that generates a lot of powerful speculative and philosophical possibilities that could inform political philosophy, normative philosophy, ethics, a whole host of things. So the implication that I find it very difficult to avoid, and sort of this is why I'm offering this presentation, is that even among non-specialists in the field of Islamic studies and Islamic intellectual history, which I count myself, the study of Islamicate civilization must play an essential role in the broader ongoing project of reflecting philosophically about the origin, the course, and the future possibilities of the modern age. So this is something that Hodgson has done very admirably. Also, Amando Salvatore here at McGill has done in his own work in a very inspiring way. But in many ways, what I feel needs to be done is that a much more kind of interdisciplinary and cosmopolitan consideration of insights gleaned from the field of Islamic studies and the reflection on the broader legacy of Islamic history, the history of Islamic thought, and place that in this global interactional framework to then bring that perspective to these very rich philosophical debates about modernity, about modern politics, about globalization, about the future of humankind. This is a major development that needs to take place in the contemporary academy. And I think through endeavors such as the speaker series and other projects ongoing at McGill, hopefully it can be advanced. So that's basically what I had prepared for the presentation today. I'd be quite happy to now receive some questions, but also to hear some of the thoughts of those who are on this call, and they might be able to sort of bring out insights from their own studies and their own fields that could further illuminate some of the themes that I've been able to raise. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Benjamin. It was a pleasure. So I see some questions are already forming. This is wonderful. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will go into the Q&A.